All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome in. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. While we're all joining, please let us know where you're joining from. We always like to hear where people are at, what time of day it's at in your neck of the woods. I'm joining from Abilene, Texas, which is like 2 hours west of Dallas. And so I'm joined by my fellow co-host, Sarah Marsh. Sarah, where are you joining from?
I am joining from the hills of Western Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh.
Oh, that's wonderful. Very good. And Nadia, are you in North Carolina right now?
I am. I'm in Chapel Hill,
All
right
right.
on campus, actually. So
Very good. Very good. All right. So we've got Western Massachusetts. Another North Carolinian is joining. Greenville, South Carolina, Virginia. Wonderful. It's getting pretty cold out there in some of those places. Arlington, Virginia, Garden City, New Jersey. All right. So welcome in, everybody. Again, we'll get started here in just one moment. We hope that everyone has had a good holiday if you were celebrating Thanksgiving. And we're vastly and quickly approaching the end of the year, which is a very busy and hectic time. So we hope everyone is well. San Diego is representing Fairfax, Virginia, Pittsburgh, close to where Sarah is at. That's wonderful. Very good.
Columbus. Wonderful.
All right. Very good. Well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Eric Bontempo, and again, I'm joined by Sarah Marsh tonight, and we're also here with Nadea Pugh, our technical director for this whole year. And so we're Jane Austen and Company, and going back to 2019, we've been aiming to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen, the Regency period, and women's literary traditions more generally. Since the pandemic, our programs have primarily been delivered online, though we did begin as in-person events. So tonight, we are continuing our Austen and the Brontes series, which began earlier this year and will be wrapping up really in January. So we're going to go on a little bit of a break for the holidays, and we'll be back in January for one more episode of Austen and the Brontes.
We've now had 3 amazing events this past month, including a talk on religion and missionary marriages by Dr. Jade Werner, Grief and Sisterhood by Dr. Claire O'Callaghan, and most recently, a visual tour through illustrated editions of Jane Eyre with Deb Barnum.
And so please visit our website to get more information about this current season, our past seasons as well. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. Our next event on January 28th is a new one for our schedule, and it's going to feature Dr. Deborah Morse. And she's going to be speaking about the poetic image in Wuthering Heights. We haven't had an episode on Wuthering Heights yet. And she'll be relating her talk to representations of emotion in Jane Austen.
This program was made possible by North Carolina Humanities, a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities that connects North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community.
Wonderful. And I'm seeing a comment asking about where, if the recordings are available, and they are available on our website. And that links to YouTube. So all of our past episodes going back to 2019 are up on YouTube. They're available to watch at any point. But now I am excited to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Mariah Frawley is professor of English at the George Washington University. She's published widely on 19th century women writers, including 2 recent essays on life writing in relation to the fiction of Anne Brontë and Charlotte Brontë. Additionally, she's the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Jane Austen, and she's currently at work on a book for Bloomsbury Publishing on key words in Jane Austen's fiction, which sounds like a very ambitious project, but that sounds incredible. So yeah, that's our introduction of tonight's speaker.
And before Mariah begins her talk, which should last about 45 minutes, our technical director, Nadea, will explain how you can send in questions during and after her performance.
hi, everybody. If you don't already know, Well, first of all, welcome to the stream. We're very excited to have you here. If you're new to Jane Austen and Company and you haven't been were with us on the stream before, you can leave comments and questions for us and for our speaker to answer by posting those in the sidebar. We'll collect those comments there and then ask them in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. You do need a YouTube or Google account to post in that sidebar, but if you don't have one, that's okay as well. You can just email your questions to us at info@janeaustenandco.org, and we'll collect questions there and ask those for you in the chat.
All right. So now, without further ado, we present Dr. Mariah Frawley and her talk, What They Talk About When They Talk About Self.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk in this particular series as well. I'm thrilled to be part of Jane Austen and Company, and I take special pleasure in presenting in a series that puts two favorite writers in conversation with one another. I'm also happy that this series pairs Austen and Brontë with an and not an or, implicitly countering the tendency to see them as competitors for our admiration. In some sense, we have George Henry Lewis to blame, as his advice to Charlotte Brontë to read Jane Austen seems to have driven her to make the now famous disparaging remarks about Pride and Prejudice, where she concludes, "I should hardly like to live with her ladies and gentlemen in their elegant but confined houses." It's so tempting to want to converse with Charlotte Brontë a bit on her take and to imagine what Austen's on Bronte's fiction might have been. Less often quoted are remarks Charlotte Brontë made to her publisher, William S. Williams, when she wrote that she had read Austen's Emma with, quote, "just the degree of admiration which Miss Austen herself would have thought sensible and suitable." Then continuing, "anything like warmth or enthusiasm, anything energetic, poignant, heartfelt, is utterly out of place in commending these works." Those of us who have committed persuasion to memory, that would be me, will object to her appraisal of Austen's lack of appreciation for warmth and enthusiasm. As Persuasion winds towards its conclusion, Anne Elliot, inwardly comparing William Walter Elliot to Captain Wentworth, explicitly thinks warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. And Wentworth famously pens a letter to Anne declaring he is half agony, half hope, a heartfelt expression of warmth and enthusiasm if ever there was one. My point is that Charlotte Brontë might have found more of what she was looking for had she looked into Persuasion. Her comments about Austen are nevertheless so revealing as to her use of feeling, and specifically degree of feeling, as a baseline evaluative standard. Feeling, its force and its regulation, is ultimately at the heart of both authors' conception of self. The tendency to compare Jane Austen and Charlotte Brontë has a long history, going back at least to Virginia Woolf, but it's not limited to literary critics. In Becoming a Heroine, Rachel Brownstein recounts funny but also revealing stories of students coming to her to share their thoughts on whether they were more like Elizabeth Bennet or Jane Eyre, whether in romantic partners they preferred a Mr. Darcy or a Mr. Rochester, or gasp, even a Heathcliff. In preparation for tonight, I racked my brain to try to remember where it was I once read a well-known author, I think it was A.S. Byatt, but I can't be sure, who was asked in an interview for her judgment on Austen and Brontë. Maybe the question was, who do you prefer? Maybe it was, who do you think is better? But in either case, the answer was a swift and decisive rejection of the question and its premise. One should refuse to choose. I couldn't agree more. And so with no further ado, and with an eye toward assessing, as my title suggests, the interests that both authors have in the nature of personhood, I'll start with a favorite scene from Pride and Prejudice. Next slide, please. In this episode of the novel, Elizabeth has gone to Pemberley in the company of her aunt and uncle, and after the extreme embarrassment of the unexpected encounter with Mr. Darcy, they each begin presenting to each other chastened and more civil personas. A day or two later, out of the blue, letters from Jane arrive to sound the alarm bells that Lydia has run off with Wickham. Austen represents Elizabeth processing the shock just as Mr. Darcy arrives to pay a polite visit. She then shares the dreadful news with him and simultaneously contemplates its consequences, not least as it promises to bring to a decisive end any newly developing affection on his part. Elizabeth soon observed and instantly understood it. Her power was sinking. Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. She could neither wonder nor condemn, but the belief of his self-conquest brought nothing consolatory to her bosom, afforded no palliation of her distress. It was, on the contrary, exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes, and never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be in vain. Self, though it would intrude, could not engross her. Austen's phrasing in this passage is worth pausing over. In all her novels, Jane Austen features scenes where heroines exert themselves to rein in their emotions and to conduct themselves properly. Next slide, please. We see it over and over again in Sense and Sensibility, as when Elinor learns that Edward is engaged to Lucy Steele, and the narrator writes, "For a few moments she was almost overcome. Her heart sunk within her and she could hardly stand. But exertion was indispensably necessary, and she struggled so resolutely against the oppression of her feelings that her success was speedy and for a time complete." Sense and Sensibility includes numerous such scenes, so much so that the critic Stuart Tave identifies exertion itself as a major player in the novel. For Jane Austen, exertion is the vital force that, fueled by resolution, enables a person to speak or act appropriately, even and perhaps especially when feelings dictate otherwise. It's one of a handful of her keywords that enable us to grasp how she understood the confluence of resolution, willpower, and agency, core components of her notion of selfhood. The self, though it would intrude, could not engross her moment in Pride and Prejudice is relatively unique in that Austen explicitly uses the word self in a standalone way. We might extrapolate that self is shorthand for self-interest. In her recent book, Reading Jane Austen, Jenny Davidson points out that Austen is a subtle theorist of self-interest with a keen eye for the way it distorts and affects people's explanations of the choices they make. At this juncture in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth is briefly distracted from her preoccupation with the Lydia mess by thoughts of her wishes with respect to Mr. Darcy. But Austen, who chose her words with such care and famously did not write for dull elves, does not use the phrase self-interest. Instead, she implicitly invites her readers to consider self as an entity in and of itself, and in relation to the train of thought that yields Elizabeth's understanding of her feelings. These feelings are what get tagged as an instantiation of the self, and that must in turn be kept in check for her to act in the interest of others. It goes without saying that we are supposed to admire Elizabeth for her embrace of duty over self. I can hear Mr. Knightley heatedly reminding Emma, there is one thing a man can always do, and that is his duty. Let's briefly compare these moments from Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility to several from Jane Eyre and Villette. Although it's important first to acknowledge the obvious, we are pivoting from novels written in the third-person omniscient perspective to ones written in the first person. The distinction is a bit complicated by Austen's subtle use of free and direct discourse, as well as the fact that she incorporates into her narratives many moments that feature characters in the act of self-reflection. as, for example, when Elizabeth thinks, "Till this moment, I never knew myself," after reading Darcy's letter, grappling with her mistaken assumption, and feeling acute shame. Still, in fully first-person novels, such as those written by Charlotte Brontë, the word myself occurs hundreds of times. And while many of these references are perfunctory, they collectively keep the reader's attention centered on and in the narrator's mind. Next slide, please. Many invocations of myself in Bronte's fiction are quite revealing. As when Jane Eyre tells her readers, "Now I wept. Helen Burns was not here. Nothing sustained me. Left to myself, I abandoned myself, and my tears watered the boards." Left to myself, I abandoned myself is such an intriguing sentence, a paradoxical statement of agency and loss of self-control. The language of self-abandonment is put to even more powerful use later in the novel, when Jane realizes she must leave Rochester. Quote, "My eyes were covered and closed. Eddying darkness seemed to swim around me. Self-abandoned, relaxed, and effortless, I seemed to have laid me down in the dried-up bed of a great river. I heard a flood loosened in remote mountains and felt the torrent come. To rise, I had no will. To flee, I had no strength. I lay faint, longing to be dead. One idea still throbbed lifelike within me, a remembrance of God. It begot an unuttered prayer. The words went wandering up and down in my rayless mind as something that should be whispered, but no energy was found to express them." Both scenes are highly potent myself moments, for lack of a better phrase, where Brontë uses the experience, or is it the feeling, of abandonment to stage intense self-scrutiny and to challenge self-control. Relaxed and effortless, I seem to have laid me down. The use of seem and the separation of I from me underscore Jane's unstable hold on self. With lost powers of exertion go that hold. Bronte's interest in and understanding of the self looms large throughout Villette as well. Lucy Snowe is not one but several selves, Anna Gibson has written. Depending on her situation or mood, Lucy might describe herself as a wan spectacle, a fugitive, a looker-on at life. She frequently emphasizes her felt erasure from the world, representing herself at one point as, quote, "a mere shadowy spot on a field of light." Lucy writes that she seemed to hold two lives, the life of thought and the life of reality. Next slide, please. Chapter 4 of Villette details Lucy's work as caretaker for Miss Marchmont, an experience undertaken out of a sense of herself as unanchored to a family or community that would give her purpose. She explains, "There remained no possibility of dependence on others. To myself alone could I look. I know not that I was of a self-reliant or active nature, but self-reliance and exertion were forced on me by circumstances, as they are upon thousands besides. And when Miss Marchmont, a maiden lady of our neighborhood, sent for me, I obeyed her behest in the hope that she might assign me some task I could undertake." Lucy echoes here the moment in Jane Eyre when Jane leaves Lowood, at first imagining freedom, but then immediately ratcheting down aspirations and expressing only a desire for, quote, "a new servitude." In Villette, when Miss Marchmont explains what kind of care she needs, Lucy resists, saying, "My doubt is whether I should have strength for the undertaking." And Miss Marchmont responds, "That is my own scruple, for you look a worn-out creature." Lucy agrees. "So I did. I saw myself in the spectacle. I saw myself in the glass, in my morning dress, a faded, hollow-eyed vision. Yet I thought little of the wan spectacle. The blight, I believed, was chiefly external. I still felt life at life's sources. The scene is vintage Brontë in its emphasis on forced independence and in the strategic use of the mirror to highlight issues of self-recognition. Think of Jane Eyre in the Red Room, seeing herself but not recognizing what she sees and taking extreme fright. Here, Lucy recognizes, but rejects the implication of the wan spectacle she sees. Instead, she associates herself with inner being, an internal capacity to feel. After Miss Marchmont dies, Lucy travels to London in search of a new direction. That chapter opens as follows. Next slide, please. The next day was the 1st of March, and when I awoke, rose, and opened my curtain, I saw the risen sun struggling through fog. Above my head, above the housetops, co-elevate almost with the clouds, I saw a solemn orbed mass, dark blue and dim, the dome. While I looked, my inner self moved. My spirit shook, its always fettered wings half loose. I had a sudden feeling as if I, who had never truly lived, were at last about to taste life. In that morning, my soul grew as fast as Jonah's gourd. Like Jane Austen, Charlotte Brontë, even in Jane Eyre and Villette, novels that present themselves as autobiographies, rarely uses self, or as here, inner self, in this standalone way. Lucy's inner self, which she likens to spirit and soul, is experienced as an animating force that fuels her. Her attention to her inner self is experienced in another way when she processes her revelation of feelings for Monsieur Paul. This is much later in the novel, and it's one of Villette's climactic moments. Quote, I think I deserve strong reproof, but when have we our deserts? I merited severity, he looked indulgence. To my very self, I seemed imperious and unreasonable, for I forbade Justine Marie my door and roof. He smiled, betraying delight. Warm, jealous, and haughty, I knew not till now that my nature had such a mood. He gathered me near his heart. I was full of faults. He took them and me all home. The phrase my very self helps to convey that Lucy's is a discovery of being rooted deeply in feeling. In their surfacing, her strong emotions, in this case of jealousy and possessiveness, have revealed not only themselves, but with them a side of Lucy's self. To graft Jane Austen's language onto the scene, it's as if that self intrudes and not only engrosses, but prevails. Do Jane Austen and Charlotte Brontë think about the self in the same way? I don't think so, not quite, even though both clearly understood self in relation to feeling and its management. A cursory take drawn only from these examples would suggest that for Austen, the self, a vessel for personal desires, is something to be recognized, but also contained, and if necessary, sublimated. For Brontë, it is something to be unearthed, felt, and understood. This admittedly cursory take might align with another that assigns Jane Austen's values to a Johnsonian era and Bronte's to the Romantics. But it's not entirely clear from these examples whether they in fact share an understanding of what the self is, but simply work in different emotional registers. To get at that question, we need more data and perhaps also a framework to understand what we are talking about when we talk about the self. So here I interrupt this program for a brief imposter alert. I am not a philosopher, nor a historian of the Enlightenment, nor even a sophisticated user of critical theory. I am only a reader. That is, a reader in the sense advocated by Virginia Woolf, a reader who thinks of herself as the author's accomplice. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. Thus far, I've been using the term self in the way I think Austen and Brontë intend. That is, to mean an autonomous, unified, introspective being. Self as rooted in Enlightenment thought that championed individualism and personal agency. This is not the self, in other words, as understood by various schools of critical theory that focus on the idea of the subject. The subject understood as less stable and more contingent, identity formed and transformed by external forces. Two key works of scholarship that I've drawn on to better understand thinking about the self in Austen and Bronte's eras are Dror Warman's The Making of the Modern Self, Identity and Culture in 18th Century England, and Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self. So let me take just a minute to sum up a few of their arguments. Next slide, please. In The Making of the Modern Self, Dror Warman explores how conceptions of identity transformed over the 18th century. He argues that early in the 18th century, identity was seen as socially constructed and changeable rather than fixed. This view of the self was rooted in external markers, such as social roles, with identity adaptable and functioning more as public performance. Warman charts a gradual change in the latter half of the century, marked by the emergence of a modern identity characterized by a belief in a stable, inner, individualized self. He attributes the transition to a broad cultural, economic, and political shift, most prominently the rise of individualism and new forms of governance that emphasized personal responsibility. His claim is that these shifts led people to internalize their identities, marking a significant cultural transformation in how selfhood was conceptualized, from changeable social performance to a more introspective and stable essence. It would be so convenient if we could assign Austen to the earlier stage and Brontë to the later, but we can't. Both writers demonstrate in their fiction a bit of both orientations. Right off the top of our heads, we can generate examples like Elizabeth Bennet's "He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter, so far we are equal" speech to Lady Catherine, and see in it an intermingling of a reliance on a social understanding of self, as well as a spirit of individualism that enables her to assert her right to determine her own path to happiness. Claudia Johnson is really wonderful on this topic, by the way. Or we can see a pronounced spirit of individualism in Jane Eyre, who even as a child bursts forth with "speak I must" when confronted with injustice, but who throughout the novel is beset with anxieties about her social status as a governess. Still, that Austen's and Bronte's eras coincide with the historical moment that ushered in the emergence of a belief in an inner individualized self is what seems most germane. All right, next slide, please. In Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor argues that our sense of self is shaped by moral and spiritual frameworks. Central to his argument is the idea that the self is not merely a standalone autonomous entity, but is deeply relational. According to Taylor, the modern sense of self emerged from an interplay of religious, philosophical, and cultural influences. He draws a through line from Plato and Augustine to Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized inner depth, as well as moral orientation. Here, too, we can see applicability to Austen and Brontë, since both authors focus on that core idea of moral orientation beyond individual desires. How else to understand Elizabeth Bennet's pivot homeward in the crucial Pemberley episode in Pride and Prejudice, or Jane Eyre's reasoning on why she must leave Rochester and Thornfield Hall? Many scholars have studied Enlightenment philosophy in relation to the early English novel. Peter Knox Shaw, for one, has shown just how deeply Jane Austen's work engages with Enlightenment ideas about the self, ethics, and social interaction. He finds in Austen's emphasis on balancing self-interest with social and moral responsibility evidence of her engagement with Enlightenment virtue ethics. Similarly, in Intellectual Women and Victorian Patriarchy, Deirdre David focuses on how Charlotte Bronte's heroines assert moral autonomy while grappling with limitations placed upon them by a patriarchal culture. In her view, Bronte's narratives assume a self that is shaped by, but also resistant to external pressures, in turn aligning with Enlightenment ideas of the individual as moral agent. One way, I think, to uncover more about the moral orientation at the heart of self in Austen and Bronte's writing is to consider the lexicon they draw on. You can tell that I'm just coming off a year writing a book on Austen's keywords, particularly their use of terms such as self-respect, self-importance, self-command, and self-reproach. Next slide, please. Self-reproach looms especially large in Jane Austen's fiction. Think Catherine Morland after Henry has scolded her for her assumptions about his father. Marianne Dashwood as she reckons with the impact of her behavior on her sisters and mother. Emma Woodhouse while she grapples with the consequences of her interventions in Harriet Smith's life. And Elizabeth Bennet when she takes in all that has led her to trust Wickham and misjudge Darcy. Self-reproach figures prominently again when Elizabeth journeys home after learning of Lydia's elopement, and the narrator describes her preoccupation in the character this way. Fixed there by the keenest of all anguish, self-reproach, she could find no interval of ease or forgetfulness. Using the word keenest to characterize Elizabeth's anguish, Austen conveys both the intensity of her feeling and its revelatory capacity. Elizabeth is awash in an emotional stew of fears, hopes, and conjectures, and blames herself, given her decision to keep her knowledge of Wickham private. Austen's novels, of course, abound with scenes where judgment is passed on conduct or assessments made about responsibility for wrongdoing. And she draws often not only on reproach, but on closely related terms such as blame, reproof, and censure. Deeming self-reproach the keenest of all anguish, though, she stresses the emotional weight scrutiny of self, a vital component of moral growth, entails. When later in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy contrasts his painful recollections of prior conduct to what he believes Elizabeth's are, he tells her that your retrospections must be so totally void of reproach, but with me it is not so. He insists that his painful memories of past behavior cannot, ought not be repelled, in essence contending that self-reproach is salutary. Self-reproach features in all of Austen's novels. In one of Persuasion's closing conversations, Anne tells Wentworth, I have now, as far as such a sentiment is allowable in human nature, nothing to reproach myself with. And if I mistake not, a strong sense of duty is no bad part of a woman's portion. Anne's hedge, as far as such a sentiment is allowable in human nature, enables Austen to subtly remind her readers that people are flawed, will inevitably make mistakes, and need self-reproach to better understand themselves and to make necessary amendments. Sense and Sensibility at one point emphasizes Marianne's initial inability to channel self-reproach into changed behavior. Marianne, the narrator tells us, felt all the pain of continual self-reproach, regretted most bitterly that she had never exerted herself before, but it brought only the torture of penitence without hope of amendment. The self posited by the idea of self-reproach is a self that can and should be bettered. In comparison to Jane Austen, Charlotte Brontë simply doesn't focus much attention on self-reproach. The phrase is absent from Jane Eyre and occurs only twice in Villette, once in reference to Monsieur Paul's habit of digging in frozen snow when, quote, urged inwardly by painful emotion or sad thoughts of self-reproach. Where Brontë may lack an emphasis on self-reproach, she more than makes up for in her attention to self-respect. So next slide, please. In recent work on the care ethic in Jane Eyre, Talia Schaefer quotes this pronouncement of Jane's: "The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself," seeing it as central to the novel's insistence that a powerless woman, can triumph. Paul Schott uses the same quotation as an epigraph to an article on Jane Eyre and the history of self-respect. He writes that in 1847, self-respect, in the sense employed by Jane, had not been in use much longer than the word autobiography, and the former word, no less than the latter, served to articulate the new sense of self that in Bronte's time was still emerging and developing against the background of a changing social order. Moments when references to self-respect surface in Jane Eyre are highly multivalent, as when Rochester, masquerading as a gypsy woman, attempts to read Jane's fortune and tells her, "I see no enemy to a fortunate issue but in the brow. And that brow professes to say, I can live alone if self-respect and circumstances require me to do so. I need not sell my soul to buy bliss. I have an inward treasure born with me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld, or offered only at a price I can afford to give." If adds palpable hesitation, living alone is acceptable only if circumstances or self-respect demand it. Next slide, please. The scene foreshadows Jane's decision to leave Rochester, where core assumptions about that need for self-respect and the strength of her inward treasure are put to the test. As Jane escapes Thornfield Hall, she thinks, and I'm sorry that print on my PowerPoint is so small, birds began singing in brake and copse. Birds were faithful to their mates. Birds were emblems of love. What was I? In the midst of my pain of heart and frantic effort of principle, I abhorred myself. I had no solace from self-approbation, none even from self-respect. I had injured, wounded, left my master. I was hateful in my own eyes. Still, I could not turn, nor retrace one step. God must have led me on. As to my own will or conscience, impassioned grief had trampled one and stifled the other. I was weeping wildly as I walked along my solitary way. Fast, fast I went like one delirious. Effort of principle sounds a bit like what Jane Austen would have called exertion, yet it's difficult to imagine such a moment in an Austen novel. Jane's grief so overwhelms that she disavows her conscience and cedes her will, crediting to God whatever fuels her movement. When Austen depicts impassioned grief, say Mary Ann's after Willoughby has abandoned her, or even Anne Elliot's deep sadness about lost love, she does so at a remove and with weight that shifts attention toward the strength and pull of conscience, the call of duty, twin engines of exertion. Next slide, please. Canvassing the vocabulary of self-words in Austen's and Bronte's fiction is a revealing exercise, as there are, of course, many more terms than self-reproach and self-respect to work with. Both authors revel in exposing and mocking the self-important. Many of Austen's characters evidence self-complacency and self-satisfaction. Her heroines fall prey to self-deception. Indeed, their moral growth often entails recognition and remediation of that flaw. Bronte's heroines experience self-doubt, and their most pronounced struggles are with self-command. Despite some seeming kinship between Austen and Brontë in this regard, there are notable differences in their approach. When Jane Austen invokes the idea of self-control, it is often in a didactic context. In Sense and Sensibility, Elinor counsels Marianne to exercise more self-command. When in Emma Woodhouse witnesses self-command in Harriet Smith, she takes it as proof of strengthened character, and so forth. Next slide, please. Mansfield Park offers revealing commentary on the ideal in its depiction of Julia Bertram, disappointed that Henry Crawford's attentions are turned to her sister, but forced to conduct herself properly. The narrator comments, "The politeness which she had been brought up to practice as a duty made it impossible for her to escape, while the want of that higher species of self-command, that just consideration of others, that knowledge of her own heart, that principle of right, which had not formed any essential part of her education, made her miserable under it." It's such classic Jane Austen commentary, isn't it? Decorum requires self-control, but it's not sufficient unto itself. Austen discriminates between self-command that is merely performed and that which emanates from within. Even that more genuine stance, though, is normative, directed toward just consideration of others. Charles Taylor would approve the self at the heart of Jane Austen's notion of self-command. Charlotte Brontë represents self-command very differently. Consider, for example, Jane's thoughts about the ivory miniature of an imaginary Blanche Ingram that she creates. She says, "It looked a lovely face enough, and when compared with the real head in chalk, the contrast was as great as self-control could desire. I derived benefit from the task. It had given force and fixedness to new impressions I wished to stamp indelibly on my own heart." She then concludes, "Ere long, I had reason to congratulate myself on the course of wholesome discipline to which I had thus forced my feelings to submit." In Bronte's hands, self-control is an exercise of discipline and punishment. She claims the experience to be wholesome, but her language bespeaks forced submission. The theme surfaces throughout Villette, too. When Lucy arrives in Villette on a dark and rainy evening, the experience tries to the utmost her powers of clear thought and steady self-possession. Her entire experience in Villette then continues the test, as she silently watches Madame Beck and Monsieur Paul rifle through her belongings, for example, or endures the taunts of Ginevra Fanshawe, or faces the loss of attention from Dr. John. She buries his letters. Self-possession and self-suppression walk hand in hand throughout Villette. One more self word and I'll wrap up. Ideas of self are, of course, implicated in the notion of selfishness, a trait both Austen and Brontë relentlessly scorn. Think of characters like John Dashwood of Sense and Sensibility, narrow-minded and selfish, Dr. Grant in Mansfield Park, an indolent, selfish bon vivant, and Elizabeth Elliot in Persuasion, all selfish vanity. Or remember that Jane Eyre's earliest nemeses, her cousins John and Eliza Reed, are headstrong and selfish. In Villette, Lucy thinks that Ginevra Fanshawe has one thing about her that seemed strong and durable, her selfishness. Both authors clearly considered selfishness a vice, but selfishness features in more significant ways too that draw attention to the foundational association of self with feeling. In the great showdown scene of Pride and Prejudice, Lady Catherine calls Elizabeth a selfish, unfeeling girl. The charge is less appealing than obstinate, headstrong girl, now widely emblazoned on t-shirts, coffee cups, and note cards. I own many, but they aren't unrelated. Lady Catherine believes that Elizabeth has willfully, even obstinately, put her own interests above those who should be above her. In that way, Lady Catherine believes she has been unfeeling. Most Pride and Prejudice readers, though, are alert to different ways the novel registers what it means to be unfeeling. Elizabeth's rejection of Darcy turns on her sense of his selfish disdain for the feelings of others. That the charge hits home, we know from Darcy's reformed manners and from his language as the novel ends, when he tells Elizabeth that he has been a selfish being all his life until he met her. In Austen's fiction, to be selfish is not to feel for the feelings of others. The self must be directed outward to be worthy. Selfishness features prominently in Jane Eyre too, especially in the highly charged episodes where St. John Rivers tries to coerce Jane into marrying him to join in his missionary work. His sisters caution her against a selfless acceptance, but in one heated conversation, St. John threatens her this way: refuse to be my wife, and you limit yourself forever to a track of selfish ease and barren obscurity. We know that Jane, she who once only aspired to a new servitude, does not in fact crave a life of selfish ease, and still less does she want to marry a man without real feeling. My favorite moment in Jane Eyre is when she tells St. John, I scorn the counterfeit sentiment you offer. Yes, St. John, and I scorn you when you offer it. Hell hath no fury like a Brontë heroine scorning. Next slide. Villette's exploration of selflessness and selfishness deserves many more minutes than I can offer as we wind down. In chapter 31, for example, we find Lucy speaking to herself as follows. Courage, Lucy Snow, with self-denial and economy now, and steady exertion by and by, an object in life need not fail you. Venture not to complain that such an object is too selfish, too limited, and lacks interest. Be content to labor for independence until you have proved by winning that prize your right to look higher. But afterwards, is there nothing more for me in life? No true home? Nothing to be dearer to me than myself, and by its paramount preciousness to draw from me better things than I care to culture for myself only? Nothing at whose feet I can willingly lay down the whole burden of human egotism and gloriously take up the nobler charge of laboring and living for others? I suppose, Lucy Snow, the orb of your life is not to be so rounded. For you, the crescent moon must suffice. This passage evidences well Lucy's continued efforts to police her aspirations, but note her pivot. It's so important. She articulates desire, but it is for something dearer to me than myself, something not for myself only. Her desire is to get beyond the very self once experienced as life-sustaining. Human egotism itself is, at its heart, a burden, she and Brontë, too, seem to say. It's one of Villette's many comments on the debilitating dangers of isolation and loneliness. How can a self be relational if there is no one to be connected to? Can a self be a self without others? So, since I began with Jane Austen, I want to conclude with Charlotte Brontë. And my last slide, please. I almost opted for the powerful moment in Jane Eyre, when Jane, driven by intense but misplaced jealousy of Blanche Ingram, cries out to Rochester, "Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart." In the last Jane Austen and Company presentation, the speech was referred to as a rant, a feminist rant, but still a rant. But I think that is too pejorative, and something like proclamation better fits the spirit with which Jane asserts a personhood grounded in the capacity to feel, and to feel strongly. Charlotte Brontë was in a different place emotionally when she wrote Villette, as we see at this particular juncture when Lucy takes stock of her life. She writes, "So this subject is done with. It is right to look at our life accounts bravely in the face now and then and settle them honestly. And he is a poor self-swindler who lies to himself while he reckons the items and sets down under the head happiness, that which that which is misery. Call anguish, anguish, and despair, despair. Write down both in strong characters with a resolute pen. You will better pay your debt to doom. Falsify, insert privilege where you should have written pain, and see if your mighty creditor will allow the fraud to pass, or accept the coin with which you would cheat him. Offer to the strongest, if the darkest angel of God's host, water, when he has asked blood, will he take it? Not a whole pale sea for one red drop. I settled another account. I have to wonder if Self-Swindler is Bronte's creation. The OED does not have an entry for it, and Swindler itself dates only to 1770. With her intense interest in self-understanding, it's entirely understandable that Bronte would scorn witting self-deceit and turn to, if not invent, a phrase like self-swindler. In terms of my focus tonight, I think what's most noteworthy about this passage from Villette is that the implied exertion is not, as it so often is in an Austen novel, outward and deliberately relational, but rather is inward. Lucy exerts herself not to subordinate her feelings, but rather to summon them and to fully face them, being brave enough not to whitewash what she finds. If Jane Austen thought self-reproach the keenest of all anguish, Charlotte Brontë might well have swapped in the seemingly more neutral but far broader reaching self-assessment. The moment in Pride and Prejudice that stresses Elizabeth's keen anguish is, after all, mostly that, a moment, even if Austen leaves unspecified just how long Elizabeth is fixed in her thoughts and their attendant feelings. Brontë, by contrast, is far more intent on recognizing deep, even painful feeling, not as something to be passed through, but rather fully felt and ultimately incorporated into her philosophy of life. All right, that is it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that talk. That was wonderful, very thought-provoking, and just so like kind of encompassing of so many works by Austen and Charlotte Brontë. There's just a lot to kind of wrap our minds around, I think. So to our audience, please don't forget to post your questions. We would love to hear from you. We've got several already that we'll bring up. Sarah, I don't know if you want to start with questions or I can start. I'm happy to pass the baton to you if you'd like.
So, Mariah, I have a question about Austen, and the passage that you started with, where Elizabeth is she's getting the news that Lydia has eloped with Wickham, and she says this can't be concealed from anyone. And I wonder what you make of the idea that this is the moment where Darcy and Elizabeth see themselves sort of exploited in the same way by Wickham's liberality,
right.
Because I mean, it's this moment of extraordinary, what might be extraordinary identification, and Elizabeth is not quite experiencing it that way at all. In fact, she wishes that she hadn't even told him. But in fact, he's already told her a very similar kind of disgrace in his own family, if it could be called a disgrace. Mm-hmm. So I wondered what you, in the scene that you started with, might say about the juxtaposition of the two selves that Austen is working on there, because they seem in really sort of amazing parallel achieved by this incredible plot. But what about the parallel self, and what's Austen doing?
Oh, I think that's such a really interesting observation. And I haven't thought about there being a juxtaposition. I haven't really thought that much about what you're positing, that they're at the same time dealing with themselves in relation to the disgrace that Wickham has imposed on them. I understand what you're saying about Darcy having already shared. with Elizabeth, that disgrace, but his was a kind of near disgrace, right? He managed to stave off the disgrace.
That's right.
They both share the silence. Neither of them have shared the story of Wickham. Darcy has with Elizabeth, but it's contained within the two of them.
Right.
So, but, in terms of that moment, I think what I was focusing on was the work that single sentence, self though it would intrude, could not engross her. And I don't know why I like that moment so much. I mean, I said, I'm going to start with a favorite moment from Pride and Prejudice. And I don't know why that's one of my favorite moments. I think it has something to do with basically liking Jane Austen's teaching throughout all of her fiction about self-absorption, the way that she castigates self-absorption. And so I like that, even though it's this wonderful moment, it's a wonderful moment for me when Elizabeth realizes that she could have loved Darcy. It's really weird. It's really distanced from actually feeling the feeling. But it's like this hypothetical, I might have been able to feel this, but now I can't. That's instead what she's feeling, is that regret and that, hypothetical what if experience. But then even that whole train of thought gets kind of cut off by self, though it would intrude, could not engross. So I was actually just, kind of more preoccupied by Austen's thinking about the self being both the feelings, but also that power to kind of intervene and cause a person to pivot away from themselves and toward their relations.
Yeah, toward the duty of family. And what struck me is that in tension with the passage from Jane Eyre where the wish is for death, right? It's not, I'm not going to turn toward family. I'm not going to turn toward social obligation or duty. I just wish I wasn't here anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it almost is like, why are we putting these two authors in conversation? We are, because the series and my idea about a talk. But honestly, sometimes when I think the fact that Charlotte Brontë is so preoccupied with heroines who are unanchored to family, they don't have the community calling them out. And so the self, then, it's like a very different kind of crucible to test the self when the self doesn't have, that's what I posed there at the end with my comments on Villette. How can a self be a self if there's nobody to be in relation to?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
it's just a fascinating tension, and it does really feel like writers of two distinctively different eras, and maybe it's just sensibility, but
yeah, it is. I mean, I keep going back and forth because I feel like both of them really are interested in how you recognize feeling and how you manage it. And there are many moments where Austen's heroines stop and think, I need to figure myself out. How do I actually feel? Emma Woodhouse does that, toward the end of Emma, when she's like, I've got to figure out, how do I feel about Mr. Knightley, and how does that make me understand myself in a way that I hadn't until forced, in this crisis moment to do that. So I don't want to dismiss the kind of seriousness with which Jane Austen takes investigation of feeling and self. It's just that in some ways I feel like there's a difference in how they understand exertion. So, you know, like in Jane Austen's fiction, those women always exert themselves to, you know, do what the right thing to do is. They exert themselves to be better people. Even Catherine Morland, you know, after she's been shamed, she, you know, commits to like a regimen of personal growth. But Bronte's heroines grapple more, I think, with like the failure of a capacity to exert yourself. When Jane Eyre says, God must have led me on, are we to believe that God did? Charlotte Bronte was a faithful person. Maybe that's what we're supposed to believe. Or is it that Jane cannot own that she's walking away from Rochester? So she says, God must have led me on because I had trampled on those principles I thought I had, my feelings trampled on them. So I think if I had more time to like really squeeze this topic dry, I would probably get stuck on how exertion functions so differently in those two novelists. Yeah.
And I have a question about persuasion, but before we move on, we got a question from an audience participant that is very timely, and so we better address this before we move on. So could Pride and Prejudice's Charlotte Lucas Collins apply here too? She enjoys managing her own home within the limitations of managing Mr. Collins's presence during her day. So maybe a different instance of enacting the self via Charlotte Lucas, via controlling her environment. I'm wondering if there's something there to pick up on.
I think there is. I would have to go back to passages and see, think about the vocabulary that Austen's drawing on to describe Charlotte, particularly in the episodes that this audience member is pointing out when Elizabeth visits them at Rosines and, you know, or hunts for whatever it's called, and observes Charlotte in her married life. But cognitive scientists have this term self-regulation that I think is really interesting, that, you know, kind of has to do with how we, the many ways, talking to ourselves, thinking to ourselves, we regulate ourselves in our speech and in our interactions with others. And so I absolutely think that Charlotte is a kind of master of that diplomatic kind of control of a scene and a situation. And so, yeah, it is a kind of self-management too. It would be really interesting in a whole other kind of paper to think about self-management and self-care, and to think about the idea of self-care across Austen and Bronte. Maybe that's what Talia Schaefer talked about when she talked to this group. I always think of her when I think of people working on communities of care and the care ethic. But I think self-care, even though that's not a phrase that Austen draws on or Bronte explicitly, it's a theme of their work. Mm-hmm. So great question, or great observation, really.
Yeah. So my question about persuasion, I think, stems from I had read a review that Virginia Woolf wrote about Jane Austen in 1924. And in that review, Virginia Woolf kind of imagines, like, what if Jane Austen had lived for another 40 or so years, as old as her brother, who lived to 91? How many more novels would she have written? What would have been the trajectory of those novels? And Virginia Woolf looks at persuasion as kind of this like transition novel for Austen.
Yes.
Where Anne Elliot is just so different from every other heroine. And one of the words that Anne Elliot is described as, like, she thinks of herself as a nobody, as somebody maybe like without a self. And I'm kind of wondering, like, is Austen starting to explore the self in a more like anticipatory way, like the Brontes do? Or
that's a really great thought, and I think the short answer is yes. I think Virginia Woolf was right to recognize that with Persuasion, Jane Austen was embarking in a kind of new direction, even though obviously some of the kind of 3 or 4 families in a country village structure is still there. But your reference to Anne Elliot's her word had no weight. Anne Elliot, nobody within the family, her word had no weight, reminds me of a phrase from Anne Bronte's short novel, Agnes Grey. I made it the title of an essay that I once wrote on Agnes Grey because it was such an evocative phrase. She's describing the experience of being a governess, and she writes, "It seemed as if they looked on vacancy," meaning that she's not seen by her employers. She's vacant. She's nothing. And in my paper tonight, I quoted I could have chosen a dozen moments in Villette where Lucy Snow kind of experiences herself as absent, a mere shadowy spot in a field of light. What makes Villette really heartbreaking for me is that if you read Charlotte Bronte's letters written at the time that she was composing Villette, you realize like, whoa, baby, this is a very autobiographical novel. Charlotte Bronte is feeling intensely the loss of her family. Her brother, her 2 sisters have died. She's living at home with her nearly blind older father. And she is thinking of herself as kind of condemned to a life of solitude and obscurity. She uses the word obscurity in a lot of those letters. So I think there are really interesting ways that we could look back at Persuasion. And like you're suggesting, Anne's kind of position in the family and that sort of word had no weight. She's not seen. I love the film version of Persuasion that has her in the periphery of the dining room as the family members and even not family members are making a decision about whether they need to retrench and move to Bath. So she's marginalized in those ways too. But I think the other thing that Persuasion does is really focus in very innovative ways on Anne's feelings. So I don't have, even though I was pretending at the beginning of my talk that I've committed the novel to memory, like warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. But there are moments when I wish I could summon them up in my brain right now, but there are moments when Anne is processing what Wentworth has just written to her, and she's feeling like time stops, the moment stops. It's this protracted moment where she is feeling intense feeling and can't even articulate what she's feeling. And she needs time to kind of get a hold of herself to be able to like compose herself and move forward and, make the decision that she makes to run out into the street and get Wentworth and make sure he knows that she's gotten the letter and wants him to come to the card party that night. So it's kind of like the attention to really powerful feeling that I think Persuasion demonstrates that Austen is moving in different directions. Again, not to say that there aren't powerful feelings in the earlier novels, like Elizabeth feels powerful shame, so does Emma Woodhouse. And when Darcy proposes the second time to Elizabeth, I love that the narrator describes it as he expressed himself as a man violently in love could be expected to do. We don't get what he said, unfortunately. We don't get to read it, but we know that it's the expression of a man who's violently in love. So there's the remove that we don't have in Brontë. Some of that is third person, first person. Some of it is cast of characters who are connected to their communities and their families versus heroines who are pretty solitary. But I think at the same time, there's a shared interest in powerful feeling, its expression, its management, its role in revealing who selves are. So
just riffing on that a little bit, Mariah, there's some really excellent questions in the chat about the role of siblings in the formation of character. And I want to make sure that I'm capturing these correctly. Let's see here. Alice writes, are Bronte's heroines more isolated and therefore more introspective? Does having siblings in the novel make a difference, maybe? And then there's a follow-on question from Janet about Jane Fairfax in Emma and the selfish-lessness of that figure. So maybe we'll do siblings first and then move on to governesses.
And Jane Fairfax, yeah, those are great observations. The sibling thing I think is really interesting. In Persuasion, Anne Elliot has her two sisters. They're not particularly close. And there's a moment when Anne has arrived to spend her time with Mary, and they go to the great house, and Anne sees the Musgrove sisters. And the Musgrove sisters are lively and being jovial, and the space is filled with music. And Anne experiences kind of a twinge of jealousy that she doesn't have the relationship with sisters that she's witnessing. And then the narrator sweeps in and says something like, but saved as we all are by comfortable feelings of superiority, Anne would not trade her place for theirs. Which I think is like another very classic Jane Austen moment, who, by the way, was extremely close, we know, with her sister, and really extremely close with her brother. So she certainly, is a person well trained to think about sibling relationships and to understand their value. So just in terms of the sibling in relation to my talk tonight, I think Pride and Prejudice is another kind of interesting case study, because there's so many moments where Elizabeth and Jane in conversation, you kind of see Jane nudging Elizabeth to, they nudge each other kind of to better self-understanding. I can't think of specific conversations right off the tip of I don't have them right on the tip of my tongue, but I feel like if I looked back at Pride and Prejudice, I could find both the conversations going in both directions, where they are central to each other's growth. They help each other understand who they are, what their feelings are, what right they have to those feelings. So they kind of teach each other in a way.
Yeah. So in sorting out Wickham's character, with reference to Darcy, and Elizabeth says there's only enough good to make one such man, or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yes,
they're back and forth with one another, and then you, like, Austen is such a genius. You realize that it's because Lydia doesn't have someone to do that with, that she ends up doing what she does, because like Lizzie's walking down that path toward being taken in by Wickham, but Jane is there to say, wait a minute, right? But Lydia doesn't quite seem to have that with Kitty or Mary.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's this really interesting sister dyads in the Bennet family.
Oh, there absolutely are. And, I'll share, I'm old. I've been teaching Pride and Prejudice for many decades, several decades, not many, but several. And I've learned so much from my students over those decades. And I feel like for the first decade, at least, I was completely like a Pride and Prejudice reader who scorned Lydia Bennet. Who saw a Lydia Bennet as reckless, irresponsible, silly, just whatever. Recently, maybe in the past 5 to 10 years, I feel like conversations with students in the classroom have helped me have changed my thinking about Lydia. I was probably just a single student once raising her hand and saying, but Lydia didn't have anybody to teach her otherwise. Lydia was, young. She was set adrift. She wasn't properly guided. And you're right. There's those dynamics. I'm one of 5 in my family, and there definitely are younger sister, middle sister, oldest sister dynamics where things shift. So Austen is, I definitely think what you're saying, Sarah, is at work with what goes wrong with Lydia. But Elizabeth also is kind of impervious to a certain extent to Jane's cautions. And it really isn't until Darcy's letter that Elizabeth, I think, is willing to really accept that Wickham is not who she imagined him to be. So let's get at the other question, which was about Jane Fairfax.
Jane Fairfax. Eric, do you want? There we go.
Yeah, she is both. I love this question because, yes, I mean, a lot of the dialogue in Jane Fairfax's speeches about what it's going to mean to be a governess are really so powerful. In some ways, I think they're off too. I think when she compares her future work as a governess to the slave trade, it's off. There's something miscalculated about the analogy, at least for me. But she is revealed in such an ambiguous way as the novel ends up as being both selfish and selfless. Selfish in allowing herself to be secretly engaged to Frank. I love it when Emma has her out. Emma is so flawed. I accept that she's so flawed. I still named a daughter after her, but she is so flawed. But I love the moment at the end near the end, when she is aghast in conversation with Mrs. Weston about what has happened with Frank Churchill coming among them, pretending to be a certain way and pretending to kind of be a friend in a confidential way. And Jane is implicated in all of that. And so that's where the real selfishness comes in. But the selflessness is clearly there too. I mean, she, in the explanatory letter and in the apologies that Jane Fairfax makes, I think she becomes a figure for somebody who developed feelings of affection for somebody and then held on to those feelings. And ultimately, Austen also admires that. I mean, she really also honors that. So that's sort of how I see the selfless, selfish confluence in Jane Fairfax. Maybe other people in the audience here have different ideas on that.
Yeah, feel free to chime in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. I'm also going to give a last call for new questions. We've got a couple more minutes. I want to get to one more or maybe two or three more audience questions as they come in. Mariah, here's another one your way that's maybe more so about the Brontes. We've talked a lot about Austen so far.
Okay.
So this is from Aaron. Austen seems to find the shaping factors of social interaction is more powerful. Bronte might be less willing to consider people as changeable past some early childhood point. What do you think of that kind of question / statement?
I think it's a really interesting conclusion to arrive at. I want to think a little bit more about whether I want to go there and say Bronte considers people is less willing to consider people as changeable. She certainly, if you think about it, another important difference that I didn't fixate on is that Bronte gives us backgrounds to her heroines' childhoods. So Jane Eyre's experiences at the beginning of the novel are so powerful. Even all the way through the Lowood episode, everything that happens afterwards, losing Helen Burns, but also the Red Room, everything that happens in Jane's childhood, you can kind of trace a through line to look at how it plays out and shapes Jane later. So she is the same person. And so maybe that means that she is less changeable. The point I made midway through my paper where I said, Jane Austen focuses on self-reproach. Here's all these examples. Bronte doesn't. Bronte focuses on, and then I pivoted to self-respect, which is a huge topic for her and so important. But I wonder if, I don't know what I think about this. Maybe other people have thoughts. If her characters don't focus on self-reproach because they don't have much to reproach themselves with. They have bad things that have happened to them, but they don't have flaws in their character that need to be remediated. Some people might disagree with that. Like I think a lot of people find Lucy Snowe really off-putting. And they also see her as a narrator, as kind of duplicitous. She plays with the reader. She withholds information. And so people can think Lucy Snowe is not trustworthy. But basically, she presents to us early this young child who lacks a home. She grows up with a woman, Mrs. Bretton of Bretton. It's like you don't get a character more rooted to place than Mrs. Bretton of Bretton. And she's Lucy Snowe by contrast. And then, catapulted from there to Miss Marchmont to eventually to Villette. And she's always unanchored and without a home. But she's not flawed in the way that Austen's characters, each of them, have flaws that need to be remediated. The only Austen novel that gives us the character as a child is Mansfield Park. And Mansfield Park is really interesting on Fanny's childhood, how young she is when she's brought to the Bertram home, what happens later in the novel when she goes back to her childhood home. So that novel's kind of an exception to the rule. And it also is a novel that problematizes in really interesting ways Fanny's change. Like, is Fanny always the moral compass that, Mr. or Sir Thomas finally learns to cherish as what he was always looking for in a daughter, his reward for his charity and bringing her into the home? That's the conclusion. But I think it's really problematic when Fanny is back at Portsmouth, but thinks of Mansfield Park as her home.
Yeah. When
Yeah.
she goes into the parlor and she's like, surely there's another room.
Yeah. And
Another
she
room.
misses the regularity, the order, the harmony, and
It's her mother, like slatternly. I mean, there's some real.
yeah, it's really uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you pick up on that. I find that a really painful moment because, it gets to you, daughters of mothers, like
I also
Fanny,
have Emma, so
Fanny thinking of her mother in that way. We understand why she does, and it's not all bad. Like there is disorder in Portsmouth. She's not wrong to perceive that, but I think the fact that Austen makes Fanny identify her home as Mansfield is something really like that's a bone that readers have to chew on for a long time. I think Villette is like, if I were doing a class on the theme of home, you would have to put Villette there. That passage I quoted where, just briefly, where Lucy is expressing her jealousy. Paul recognizes that she loves him, and she says something like, he took all my faults in, he took me home. What does she mean? He brought me home. Her understanding of home is not place. It's belonging. It's companionship. It's, being so close with another that she's not just stuck with herself and alone. So I think I think Villette is a really interesting novel on that theme.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of the conversation that Elizabeth and Darcy have about like, well, you couldn't be too close to home. Like you wouldn't always be there. Right. And
Yes.
the way of like drawing one another out, right? About, well, where do you want to live?
Yeah. How far is too far? How far is close? Yeah. And the novel ends on that point, basically, with like, but they were far enough away, and they didn't have to see him very often. The Sense and Sensibility is, and this is to the point about siblings that somebody raised earlier, and I've had students make this point too, that Sense and Sensibility is ultimately a love story about siblings, not about romantic male-female partnerships. And I love that Sense and Sensibility ends with the kind of note about the proximity of where Eleanor and Edward and Marianne and Colonel Brandon are. And it means that the sisters are going to be interacting daily and their husbands actually like one another or something like this. She makes a kind of humorous point, but it still is like it ends on that note of proximity, continued proximity between the sisters.
Yeah, without without inducing coolness between the husbands or something like that. And you're like, yeah, well, the real love story here, the two people who really took care of one another when it mattered, or
exactly. The Ang Lee film version of Sense and Sensibility, I think, is so good at Emma Thompson is so good at conveying the intense worry and sadness that she experiences as Marianne declines, and the relief she experiences when she recovers. So yeah, you're right. It's again, it's kind of back to that care ethic too, and it's siblings that are at the heart of it, which I think is fascinating.
I apologize. We should get to some of the others in the chat, but it does seem to me that like one of the things that Eleanor does in Sense and Sensibility is that she works on Marianne enough to sort of protect Marianne from herself, right? So that she can't go so overboard with her disappointed feelings, right?
Yeah.
And the Lee just captures that.
It does, but it kind of reminds me now of our audience member who asked about Brontë and are the characters changeable? Because I think Jane Austen explores in subtle ways. I was saying, like, yes, they all exert themselves and become better people, but she explores what you can't change. And so remember, at the end of Sense and Sensibility, Marianne comes up with her like program. I'm going to be knitting 5 hours a day and reading and doing music, and that's all I'm going to do. And Eleanor, there's a funny wry moment where Eleanor like recognizes that the same enthusiasm that Marianne had been channeling in this bad direction, she's now channeling in an equally kind of untenable direction. And I'm reminded that in Northanger Abbey, when Catherine Morland, she's gotten scolded in Henry's mother's bedroom and she thinks she's going to change. And she does a little bit. But there's also a funny moment where it's like, this couldn't happen, not in the Midlands of England, maybe in the Alps. She wasn't, we don't know if it could have happened in the Alps. And so there's like that pullback on Austen's part, that Catherine still has her naivete and her, propensity to be guided by what she's read. So I think Austen is, I think both authors actually are really subtle on that very interesting question of how much we can change who we are. The nature versus nurture question. I saw some things in the chat from people about films, and I really wish there were a great film version of Villette. I don't think there is. I'm dying to write to Jane Campion, the director who did The Piano, because I think she would be so perfect to take on Villette, and I would be happy to write a screenplay for her, but I doubt. I think that's probably a fantasy. My life will not be long enough for that, but maybe some junior Charlotte Brontë scholar coming up the ranks will be charged with that task. But I would love that. And I remember once reading on Twitter, I'm no longer on Twitter, now I'm on Blue Sky, but I remember once reading on Twitter, a literary agent had texted or posted something like, get yourself a Monsieur Paul. And I was like, oh my God, there's somebody out there who knows how great Monsieur Paul is. Like, he is... Forget Mr. Rochester, Monsieur Paul. He is this man who knows who Lucy is deep inside. Maybe Rochester, in that gypsy reading of Jane, knows Jane, but does he? If Rochester really knew Jane, would he have put her to that test? Stay with me, be an adulterer, be a bigamist, that language isn't used explicitly, but I'm just saying he puts her to that test. Does he really know her? Monsieur Paul is a different kind of person who understands better who Lucy Snow is. So you can see I probably take these stories a bit too much to heart.
No, this is great, but unfortunately, we are out of time. And this conversation, of course, we could keep going and going. But if you're still in the audience, please drop a line for Mariah and say thank you for just a wonderful talk. We really appreciate you being here with us this evening. Thank you so much you touched on all 6 novels, I think, especially during the Q&A.
I feel like I gave the audience a bit of whiplash going back and forth.
You even snuck in Northanger Abbey at the end. It was perfect.
Yeah.
I'm just really grateful. Yeah, we'll get that next time, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank everybody.
All right, so next events. Let's talk about next events. We have a bit of a break before we have our next JA & Co event. It takes place on January 28th, and we'll be joined by Dr. Deborah Morse. We have been so proud to be able to maintain a pay what you can format that kind of relies on donations for support of this program. If you are in a position to donate, please consider doing so. I think today is Giving Tuesday. So if you have anything left to give, we would be grateful for your support. So here's a QR code. There's a link where you can donate as well. Or when you register for that January 28th event, please consider donating.
And just a reminder, the recording of tonight's presentation will be posted to our website, janeaustenandco.org, and to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight. If you can't wait until our next event, you can view any of our previous programs on the website, which contains the archive of all of our previous lectures, over 40 of them, on topics ranging from Austen's daily musical practice and music books to the work of Regency textile designer Anna Maria Garthwaite, to multicultural adaptations of Jane Austen's novels. We have enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming for the past 3 years.
Thank you, Mariah. We really appreciate you.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good evening.